Hello everyone and welcome to this video about the iWars competition. The iWars competition aims to provide a platform for participants to experience the role of a cybersecurity expert. As part of the competition, each player is tasked with building their own country through the gathering and trading of raw materials, manufacturing finished products, training civilians and soldiers, exploring new territories, and constructing buildings on the territories. In addition, players must engage in espionage and battles with other players who also govern their own countries. Success in the competition requires not only employing effective strategies to outsmart other players, but also collaborating with them while staying vigilant against potential cyber attacks or hacking attempts from other players. The competition is typically played for a week or two, and the winner is the player that accumulates the maximum wealth. Now, this competition is maintained and managed by a competition administrator who may choose custom settings for many of the parameters associated with the competition. The competition is controlled by software called the monitor, and players participate in the competition by connecting to the monitor using a software called client. The functionalities of the monitor include keeping track of the players connected to the monitor and the duration of time for which they stay connected, distributing resources to players, keeping track of the ownership of assets, calculating the market values of the resources based on rarity, monopoly, and demand, determining the outcome of wars, supporting a player's attempt to gather information about other players' assets, and maintaining a scoreboard that is accessible on the internet. The principal functionality of the client is to communicate with the monitor. It does so by using two main components, a sender and a listener. The sender is called the active client and the listener is called the passive server. The active client is used for synchronous communication with the monitor, and the passive server is used to receive asynchronous messages or notifications from the monitor. Now let's discuss the economy of the competition. The economy in iWars comprises 15 resources, which include a currency called rupulars, 9 raw materials such as oil, steel, plastic, copper, and others, and 5 finished products like computers, weapons, vehicles, ships, and aeroplanes. Raw materials or rupulars are distributed to players periodically by the monitor. The monitor randomly selects one raw material for each player and distributes only that specific resource throughout the game. Therefore, players must trade with other players to acquire other raw materials. The monitor rewards players who stay online and expose themselves to attacks by distributing raw materials to them, while resources are deducted from players who are offline. This feature aims to prevent wealthy players from withdrawing from the competition. Finished products are manufactured using raw materials, and they tend to have a higher market value than the total worth of the raw materials used to produce them. Players can utilize finished products for particular purposes, such as utilizing computers for spying on other players, using weapons in wars, and using vehicles, ships, and aeroplanes for the transportation of resources, civilians, and soldiers to other players during trades or wars. All the resources have a market value that is determined by their rarity, monopoly, and demand. Now let's talk about the population. Now each player begins with a town hall which can be utilized to train civilians. The number of civilians that can be trained is based on the town hall's capacity, and the rate at which they can be trained is determined by the town hall's speed. Players can increase the capacity and speed of their town hall by upgrading it using rupulars, with each subsequent upgrade being more expensive than the previous one. Civilians can perform various tasks, including finding territories, working in buildings, and undergoing training to become soldiers. Once civilians have completed their training and become soldiers, they can no longer carry out civilian-specific tasks. Additionally, civilians can be transferred to other players, and they can even be captured as prisoners during wars. In addition to the town hall, players also start with a building called post. The post can be used to train civilians into soldiers, with the number of soldiers that can be trained determined by the post's capacity, and the pace at which they can be trained is determined by the post speed. Players can increase the capacity and speed of their post by upgrading it with rupulars, with each subsequent upgrade being more expensive than the previous one. Soldiers can perform various tasks, such as defending the player's territories or attacking an enemy player's territories. Soldiers can even be transferred to other players, and they may even be killed in wars. Now let's talk about the territories. Players can explore and discover territories by sending civilians on exploratory missions. Once a territory is found, players have the option to spend rupulars to construct a building on it. Additionally, players can assign civilians to work in the building and soldiers with weapons to protect the territory. If desired, players can even demolish the building on the territory by spending rupulars. Each territory can only have one building and a predetermined number of civilians and soldiers. Players can spend rupulars to upgrade the territory to support more civilians and soldiers. Players compete for control of territories by declaring wars. Territories cannot be destroyed. They can only be found, lost to other players, or acquired from other players through wars. Next, let's talk about the buildings that can be built. So players can construct buildings on their territories by spending rupulars. Currently, there are 9 different types of buildings available, each with its unique property. The first one is the collector building. Now, collector buildings allow players to gather raw materials on their own territories. For instance, building a collector oil building allows players to collect oil, while a collector steel building will let a player collect steel. The amount of raw materials gathered depends on the number of civilians assigned to work in the building. Next type of building is a factory. Factories let players manufacture finished products. For example, a factory weapon building enables the production of weapons, while a factory ship building lets players build ships. The quantity of finished products manufactured depends on the number of civilians assigned to work in the building and the availability of raw materials that are required for synthesis. Next is an IT cell. An IT cell enables players to engage in espionage by using their computers to find sensitive information about other players. Players must deploy civilians to work in the IT cells to avoid being caught engaging in espionage. Next, we have a port which allows players to operate ships, and airports allow players to operate airplanes. A hospital can be used to save and treat soldiers wounded in a war, and it can even be used to manufacture bioweapons. A research center, on the other hand, allows players to increase their weapon effectiveness in wars, and it can also be used to manufacture nuclear weapons. A communication center lets players send messages to other players. A bank allows players to send rupulars to other players digitally. Without a bank, players must use their vehicles, ships, or aeroplanes to transport rupulars to other players, which can be time consuming. Next, let's talk about the map. Now, all the players in the competition are situated on a simulated map that closely resembles reality. The distance between the players is measured in miles. Whenever a new player joins the competition, they are placed a certain distance away from the previous player. However, the first and the last players are not considered neighbors, resulting in the farthest distance between them. It is expected that players will utilize their position on the map to their advantage. Players also have the option to transport resources, civilians, or soldiers to their allies as parts of trades, or they can use soldiers and weapons to attack their enemies as parts of war, now using their ships, vehicles, or aeroplanes. Operating ships requires a port, while operating aeroplanes requires an airport. Now, each mode of transport has a specific speed and capacity that depends on the configuration set by the administrator. Typically, ships are the slowest but can carry the most goods. Airplanes are the fastest but can carry the least goods. and vehicles are in the middle in terms of speed and capacity. Players may use the transport mechanism to trade their assets with other players. For a trade to be complete, both the players must individually transport their resources or people to the other player. Players may communicate with each other through the functionalities provided in the game to broker trade deals with the other players. Violating the trade deals may result in players declaring wars on each other. Now, players may declare wars on other players by using the transport mechanism to send soldiers and weapons, which are collectively called as troops, to an enemy player's territories. These soldiers would engage in a sequence of battles against the soldiers stationed by the target on their territories. Each battle would result in a loss of troops for both the warring parties. Players may send more troops to an ongoing war to boost their forces, or players may use the time between battles to strike an agreement and withdraw their troops and stop the war from continuing. A war ends when one of the warring parties loses all their soldiers in a battle. If an attacker wins, the attacker takes control of the territory that is owned by the defender. The attacker also gets control of the building constructed on the territory and the weapons that are not destroyed in the war. The attacker also captures the civilians working in the building as prisoners. If the defender wins, the defender keeps control of their territory. The defender also gets control of the weapons that are not destroyed in the war and the transport vehicles left behind by the attacker. Additionally, players may also use their nuclear weapons or bioweapons to attack other players. A nuclear attack on a territory destroys the building and weapons present on it, and kills the civilians and soldiers that are also present on the territory. A bio attack, on the other hand, kills 10% of the civilians and soldiers present on it at periodic intervals. A bio attack can be stopped by evacuating the territory and leaving it empty for a certain period of time. A bio attack does not harm the building or weapons present on the territory. Civilians working on a territory that is won in a war may be caught as prisoners of war. An attacker cannot use these prisoners to perform civilian tasks, but they count towards the attacker's town hall capacity. So this would make these prisoners a burden on the player's economy. So for example, if a player has a civilian capacity of 50 and if a player captures 25 civilians, so he can only train 25 additional civilians even though he has a capacity of 50. So having a capacity of 50 but having 25 prisoners effectively means the player can only have 25 civilians who can work on their territories. So now this would make these prisoners a burden on the player's economy. Now a player can perform the following actions to deal with the prisoners of war. A player can send the prisoners back to their host player, or a player can send the prisoners to a player other than the host player, or a player can release the prisoners and make them stateless. Now prisoners sent to other players may be used to perform civilian tasks, but prisoners released become stateless and are lost from the game. Now players may use their IT cells to engage in espionage. Espionage lets a player extract sensitive information about resources, territories, buildings, civilians, soldiers, and even passwords related to other players. To engage in espionage, players must first construct an IT cell and use their computers to request the monitor about information related to other players. These requests may not always be successful, and a player may use more computers per request to increase the chance of success. Every time a player engages in espionage, their risk of getting discovered also increases. If this risk exceeds a certain threshold, the monitor may notify the other player about them being spied upon. So to avoid getting caught, a player must make their civilians work in the IT cell to reduce this risk. So now this application is designed to replicate the working of countries and governments in the real world through features such as territories, trades, wars, and espionage. Some of the actions that a player could perform, like the use of nuclear or bioweapons, or engaging in espionage or trafficking prisoners, may be considered illegal or unethical, and the players may be asked to not engage in these actions. The competition administrator may even formulate rules and laws for a competition, and all the participants would be expected to adhere to these rules. To enforce these rules, there are special accounts in the game having special privileges. The United Nations account may send troops to help their members in times of war. The World Bank account may loan resources to players in need. And the International Court of Justice account may accept complaints from players and determine if any of the players violated the rules or laws of the competition. These special accounts may be run by the competition administrator, the professor, or a student committee that is selected through elections in the class. In case of a student committee running these accounts, the competition can also be accompanied by an in-person model United Nations exercise where students discuss the violations of the rules and laws of the competition. So this was a brief summary of the iWars competition. And if you have any questions, please leave it in the comment section below. Thank you.